In this video, I want to briefly touch on using custom attributes. I'm going to show you an example where we add a custom attribute to a component so it will display more information within the inspector. So without further ado, let's jump straight in. So first I want to note that if you don't know what attributes actually are, if you've spent any time in Unity, you've probably already been using them and didn't even realize they are attributes. So let's take a look. If I skip the scene for now, and trust me, we'll come back to that in a moment, and go straight into Visual Studio, we can look at one of our components, one of our classes derived from MonoBehavior. Now, the attributes are quite vast in here. We've got header attributes like interactions and shown details, which basically, when we show this component in the inspector, these will come up as headers above the serialized fields that come up underneath them. And that's the next attribute, serialized field, which basically tells Unity that this particular variable has to be serialized. And then underneath it, there's a tooltip that your designers will love when they're actually using the inspector and they can hover over a variable and say, okay, I know this one will enable me to set whether this prop can be moved by a player. And another attribute on here is disallow multiple component. And this basically tells Unity that only one of these components can actually be added to a game object. And the last one we have is multi-line, that says that this variable, when it's shown in the inspector, because it's a description, will actually have multiple lines of text that will be entered. And we can also add another one. We can add component menu. And we could just set here that my menu, and we could say what the actual item is. And what this does is it specifies that Unity in the editor, when you press the add component button on the inspector, will prop this up under the folder my menu, and it will call it identifiable prop. And those are all the attributes on this particular class. So what are attributes? Well, they're basically a method for associating metadata with the code, like methods and classes and variables, etc. So for instance, we have serialized field. And as I said, this is setting metadata to our variable to say it needs serializing. And then using reflection, the Unity editor will actually perform various actions to make this happen. I'll actually leave a link in the description of this video where you can learn more about attributes, what they are, and what you can do with them. So you can take what I show you here and build tons of attributes across your code. But for now, let's jump in feet first by creating our first custom attribute, which we'll use to set a readable name and description to our components that shows up in the inspector. So let's jump back into Unity. Here we are. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a script. And this script we're going to call component attribute. Now, even though we use this in all the editors for the custom inspectors we're going to create, this has to be in the scripts folder because the component attribute is actually going to come above and be placed on the MonoBehavior classes, so the components. And I'll show you that in a moment. So let's open our component attribute. Now, this isn't going to be a MonoBehavior, so we don't need any of this. It's actually going to derive from the attribute class, which is from the system library. Now, our component attributes are going to have a name and a description. So public string name, and we're going to put it in getter and setter, but we'll make the setter private because we don't want to set it anywhere else. And we'll default this to null. And we're going to do the same thing with a description. So let's come in, we'll select that, and we'll change that to description. There we go. Now we're also going to want to build some constructors for this because we want to be able to set these particular variables at the point of construction. So string name, and that's just going to set the name to the name. There we go. Because the minimum we want to have is them to set a name for the component. They might not need to set a description every single time, but we're going to give them that option to set both at the same time. So component attribute, string name, string description, and this name and description equals description. There we go. So we've actually set up both our name and our description in our constructors for when we actually apply this component attribute. Now, the next thing we actually want to do is we want to specify where this attribute can get used. Because as you see, if we look back into our identifiable prop class, you can see that some of these are on the class, some of these are on variables, some of them will be on methods, etc. And what we could do is we can use an attribute again, and in this case, we're going to use attribute usage. And this sets the target for this attribute. In this case, we only want the class to be used. We don't want this to be applied to methods, variables, or anything else. We just want it to be applied to the class. So we'll save that off. Now, in using this, we basically do the same thing we've been doing with all these other attributes. We come in, we specify component, and then we type in the name. In this case, I'm going to give it identifiable prop. And then we set a description for this. So this component will be used in labels to identify the prop. So now our designer will know that this component will be used in the labels as they roam around the world in this particular scene. So let's save that off. Now we know these are going to be used in the inspector. And if I come back into Unity and I select one of the props in our scene, in this case, I'll actually select a chair. So we'll come into scene, we'll come into chair, there we go. We'll notice that nothing comes up just yet. And that's because we need to write a custom inspector, a custom editor that enables us to take those attributes and display them above all the variables. But before I write that custom editor, let's look at this scene, and isn't it fantastic? I actually downloaded this from the asset store and tied it up with some post-processing so you get the bloom, etc. that you see here. If you like this asset, I'll leave a link in the description and you can go and get it for yourself. So let's get to writing our editor. So as I already said, we have an identifiable prop editor. It doesn't have anything in it at the moment. All it does is it derives from the base class editor, which is from the Unity editor library. And that would enable us to do the onInspector GUI, etc. But what we're going to want to do is we're going to actually want to create our own base editor that derives from the Unity engine base editor. That enables us to add a template that all of our editors will then derive from and be able to get all these custom attributes. So back in Unity, we'll come into the editor folder and we'll create a class called base editor. And if we load that up into Visual Studio, this won't actually be a mono behavior, it will be an editor. And as we know, editor derives from the Unity editor. Now I'm going to make this abstract. And the reason is I don't want to actually create this on its own. I don't want to create this itself. This is something that everything is going to derive from. And let's do that. If we come into the identifiable prop editor, we're going to change this over to use base editor. Excellent. Now in here, let's start by overriding the inspector. And you've probably seen this if you've watched my other videos. I've done this a million times. And all we'll do is we'll come in here and we'll just put in a label that says hello, just so we can see it actually working. So we save, we come back into Unity. And once we've reloaded, we select one of our chairs. And as you can see here, we have the hello coming up. But let's get to grabbing our custom attributes. So we'll go back into base editor. And what we want to do is we actually want to collect all the attributes we're interested in at the very beginning before we start doing all of our GUI and drawing on the inspector. And then we're going to use them in our inspector GUI. So if we want to do something like that, we can come in and we can just actually do that in onEnable, which gets called when you select the inspectors, when it starts running in game, etc. And in here, we're going to be collecting the component attribute that we're going to use throughout our inspector. And we're just going to set that to null at the moment. Now we'll come in here and we'll say if component attribute equals null, then we're going to get our component attribute. And the way we do that is we basically send the target. And if you don't know what target is, basically editor provides you with a target variable. And this is the object that is involved in the editor. So in this case, the identifiable prop editor uses a custom editor for identifiable prop, and the identifiable prop will be the target we actually get. And because we've applied the component attribute to the identifiable prop, that's the one we're interested in looking at. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this component attribute into a separate function, and I'll explain why after I've done it. So I'm going to make this a static function, and this is going to return a component attribute, and we're just going to call this get component attribute. Now we're going to pass it the object, the target, and this target is of type object, so we'll just use that. So in here, in our onEnable, we're going to say the component attribute equals get component attribute. If I can spell it, there we go, target. So it's going to send in the object, it's going to get back the component attribute. Now, the reason I've made this static is because maybe not all of your editors want to derive from the base editor. Let's say you've got a package from somebody else, and that package actually has its own editors and does lots of things, but you still want to use your component attribute and you've derived off their editor. Well, because I've made this static, you can use this function elsewhere to get that component attribute without having to just copy and paste this code over. So there's a little tip for you. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to return the reflected custom attribute. So we're going to need the type because we're interested in the identifiable prop type, and we're going to ask it to get the custom attribute from that type. And the one we're interested in, obviously, is component attribute. And as I said, this uses the reflection library to do that. So just to run through it again, we pass the target, which is an identifiable prop. We then get the type of that target, which is identifiable prop as a class. We then ask to get the custom attribute of that class of type component attribute, which the component attribute is the type, and this is the component up here. And it should be noted that we use component here. It actually loses the component attribute. It's just called component when you use it. So we come back into the base editor, and here, that's great. We can pass back the custom attribute of type component attribute, but what happens if there isn't one? What happens if we haven't applied it? Well, we kind of still want to see a title nice and neat in our inspector GUI. So what we'll say is if the left-hand side, this side, is null or false, then basically we're going to want to create a new component attribute, and this is going to use the type, and we're going to pass that to string. There we go. So what we're saying here is if this doesn't work, then use this side, and this side will be a new component attribute because we know what the type is and we can just use that. Yeah, it won't be nicely camel cased and readable and all the rest, but at least it will be something. At least we will know it will be part of one of our inspectors. Right, now it's time to use that component attribute. So where we've got hello here, let's swap that out, and we'll use component attribute and we'll do name. So now if I save and I come back into Unity and I select one of my chairs, we can see identifiable prop. And that's the name that we actually gave the identifiable prop in the component attribute. Here we go, identifiable prop. Excellent. But obviously that looks rubbish. It's just a name at the end, and we might as well be using this in the inspector. So let's try and make that nice and neat. Let's make it look good and be representative of what we're actually creating. So back in the base editor, let's start actually creating out this inspector GUI to look the way we want it to look. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually create a static function called header GUI. And this is what's going to draw our name and our description from our component attribute. So we're going to pass that component attribute. There we go. Now, the reason again that I'm using a static function here is, again, if you're deriving off something that can't be the base editor, so if you can't derive off this because you're using somebody else's package, blah, 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 then you could still pass the component attribute to this and still use the same drawing functionality, so everything will look the same and you don't have to do your copy and pasting. But what we're going to do is we're going to do header GUI here, and we're going to pass it the component attribute, and we'll get rid of this basic label. Now, the reason we're doing it here is we want it before the rest of the inspector. So we're going to do our header GUI, then we're going to draw the rest of the inspector that we're actually interested in. So, looking at the header GUI, we're going to say, if we have a component attribute, so let's just make sure we've got one, because we don't know that we're definitely coming in on this route. We're first off going to give it a bit of space. And if you've seen any of my inspectors before, you know I like to put a bit of gaps in my inspector. It makes the inspector a little bit longer for each component, but it makes it a hell of a lot more readable. And that's what GUI layout space actually does. Now, we're going to firstly start with creating the title. So we're going to begin a horizontal area, and we're going to set some flexible space. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set flexible space again. And this will all make sense in a second. And we're going to end our horizontal area. Now, what this flexible space is doing is it's saying, right, I want to begin a horizontal and I'm going to put some space. So we're going to have some space to start off with. Then we're going to draw the thing, and then we're going to put some space afterwards. And that means that everything is middle justified in this particular part. And the reason I use these areas is if I want to add extra stuff into this, it will all be nicely laid out. Now we're going to put in our label, and we're going to use the component attribute, and we're going to set it to name. So now we come back into Unity. It loses from down the bottom in the inspector and it comes up the top. There it is, identifiable prop right up the very top. Now, this is quite squished next to this script, so let's actually put some space in there as well, and we'll make it a lot bigger. So we'll come back in and we'll copy this GUI space here, and we'll make this a little bit larger as this is a title. So that'll put some space afterwards. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that this label is nice and bold. So we're going to give it its own style. And this is something called a GUI style. So if I come up here and I say GUI style, and we're going to call this title style. And this is going to be a new GUI style that we're actually going to use. Now, what I want to note here is if I was to do this and then in the label use the title style that I'm interested in, this is going to create it every time. We just don't need that in our life. We can actually save this off and use that saved version of this. So GUI style, title style was null, and then down here we'll basically make this title style. And what we'll say is we'll say if title style equals null, then create it. Now you notice it complains, and that's because it's not static and we're in a static function. So let's come in and make this static. There we go. Now it's going to save it off and we'll be able to use it. So the first thing I want to do is make it a little bit bolder, make it a little bit bigger. So we're going to say the font size is going to equal 15. And we're also going to say that we want it to be bold. So font size, font style, bold. There we go. And just to keep things nice and neat, we're going to set its alignment to be middle center. Because even though we've got these flexible layouts, they're just for the label. They're not for what the contents of the label is. So we'll set this to middle center. So now if I save and I come back out into Unity, you'll notice that our identifiable prop comes into nice, big, bold, identifiable prop, which is great and all, but it's black, and that's weird. We want this to be white. And also, it doesn't look like the other labels that we've currently got running around in our actual inspector. So if I come back in, what I can actually do is in the GUI style, I could say, right, well, give me what the other labels look like. So in this case, I say, what our current GUI skin label, what that looks like, take all the attributes from that and set them to our GUI style. And then we'll just override the ones that we're interested in this case, making it bigger, making it bolder, and middle center. So let's save, come back into Unity. And we'll notice it comes nice and white, nice and big, and it looks like other labels. It looks like a header label. Now that's all good for our titles, but we had a description in there as well. So let's jump back into Visual Studio. What we're going to do is we're going to do the description. Now we could just copy and paste this down here and say, okay, just do description, but then it will look exactly like the title. And we don't want that. Let's actually make this, and I've realized I've missed off that beginning horizontal. That would make it look really weird. Let's make this look like a description should, where it's put in a box and it's nice and neat. So what we'll do here is we'll just change this out and say, okay, our GUI layout box. So we're going to add a box, and that box, all it's going to have is the description text. So again, we save, we come back into Unity, and boom, this component will be used in labels to identify the prop. We've got something in a box for us, but we can make this a little bit neater. So we'll come back in and we'll say, set the width of this box. So width, screen, and this isn't actually the screen, it's actually just the width of the inspector. Kind of a weird thing that Unity does. And we'll just say we want it to be 80%. So there we go. Come back into Unity, and when we watch this, there we go. It's a little bit neater now. We get more of the box and we get it wrapping around in the text. Okay, so let's say we create another script, and let's call this one swappable prop. And this is going to derive from identifiable prop. Identifiable prop. There we go. So if we come back into Unity, we'll apply this swappable prop to the table. There we are. Now it doesn't show anything above, and that's because we haven't overridden the editor. So at the moment, all this knows is it's taking the variables and popping them in. As there's no overridden editor, it doesn't know to do anything else. So what we can do is we can actually come back into swappable prop, and we can give this a component title like we did the other one. Swappable prop. And we could say in here, used to swap between props by the user. That could be our description. There we go. We can save this, come back into Unity. Now we'll need to override the editor for this swappable prop. So we'll come in, create a C# script, swappable prop editor. Jump into Visual Studio and identifiable prop editor. And don't forget to make sure to set it to be a custom editor, which of course comes with Unity editor. And this will be type of swappable prop. Save that, jump back into Unity. And now if I select my table, voila, swappable prop used to swap between props by the user. So that's all I wanted to cover in this tutorial. I just wanted to show you the basics of custom attributes and how you could use them to create something like a base editor or various editors going down the line. It's nothing glamorous this time, but nonetheless, I hope you got something out of it. And if you did, you know what time it is. It's time to perform the YouTube shuffle by hitting the like button and subscribing if you haven't already. Now, I know a load of people, as soon as I start doing the outro, they basically leave and move on to the next tutorial or some show that they've been watching on YouTube, and they don't stay to the end credits. But for all you wonderful people that decided to stay to the end credits, I'm going to give you a bonus tip this time. And I might do this in future videos, so make sure to stay to the end. If you look at the component, you'll notice there's a button up here, and it's a help button. If you press this help button, it launches the monobehavior page from Unity, which is rubbish. I mean, why do you want to see that? You know what monobehavior is. And if you're a designer, that's not going to help you whatsoever. So if we jump into the script, swappable prop, we can add another attribute, help URL, and we can enter a URL here, maybe the Ko-Fi page for Warped Imagination. If I save this, come back into Unity, now if I go to my table and I press the help button, voila, the Warped Imagination Ko-Fi page where you can donate if you feel like you're getting benefit from all these videos. But in all seriousness, you could actually set this to be a wiki page on your GitHub or a page on your website that basically tells the user what the component does and how they use it. Basically an instruction manual. And that will benefit your designers and your artists as they use your components and your tool set. So if you stay to the end, let me know in the comments and confuse other people by talking about the last tip that they missed. And as always, thanks for watching.